Good afternoon. My name is Stefano Lupino, and on behalf of EXCiPACT, welcome to the introductory webinar on the EXCiPACT new Good Warehousing Practices Standard. The EXCiPACT 2021 edition of the Certification Standards for Pharmaceutical Excipient Suppliers, third version, replaces the 2017 edition. The major change is the inclusion of a new Good Warehousing Practices, GWP, certification standard for distributors of closed-pack pharmaceutical excipients worldwide. This GWP standard is effectively a subset of the present EXCiPACT GDP requirements for this specific scenario. And so, to today's event, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Ian Moore, President of EXCiPACT, Global Head of Quality Assurance for Croda Europe Limited, a manufacturer of specialty and performance chemicals based in the United Kingdom. Dr. Moore has worked for Croda for 34 years and for more than 25 years in various quality roles, including overseeing 2 UK regulatory inspections. He has contributed to the publication of European and US national standards, as well as many IPEC guides. He was project leader for the development and delivery of the EXCiPACT certification scheme and stood as its first president, and has latterly returned to the board as the new president and chairman of the board, succeeding Kevin McGlew, who held the role since 2016. He is also chair of the GMP committee of the European Federation for Cosmetic Ingredients, which oversees the AFFCI GMP guide and standard for cosmetic ingredients. Before I give the floor to Ian, I will take a few seconds to talk about the logistics of today's webinar. In the meantime, we kindly ask you to let us know your status. A poll will appear on your screen in the coming seconds. Ian will speak for approximately 30 minutes. Then we will have time for questions. Please submit the questions in the panel as the presentation flows so that we can have time to triage them and cover as many of the questions you have. If we are unable to process the questions live, we will do our best to reply in writing after the webinar. You will receive a link to the recorded webinar and the copy of the slide deck after the webinar. In the meantime, you can find the standard in the handout section of this platform and on our website, excipact.org. Okay, thank you for the voting. We see that many attendees are voting. We are going to close the poll. And we can see that 46% of at current attendees are distributors, 29% are manufacturers, and 18% other. There are a few users and some people from educational background. So at the very end of the broadcast, a feedback survey will pop up on your screens. We do appreciate if you can take a few seconds to complete that, as it does help us to improve these webinars. So without further ado, I'm going now to pass over to you, Ian, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano, for that great introduction and covering all the technicalities of today's webinar. So welcome, everybody. And I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about EXCiPACT's latest development, a standard for good warehousing practices. As if we didn't have enough GXP to cope with in the industry, we've now coined something for the letter W, warehousing. So let's have a look and see how this fits into the EXCiPACT family and how it helps to assure the safety and supply of excipients. Here's an image of the new standard. We've taken the opportunity to republish this. As Stefano says, this is now available in PDF format, and there are limited hard copies available as well. And we've introduced GWP to complement the good manufacturing practices and good distribution practices that were already part of EXCiPACT. Of course, we still remain members, our founding members remain a core part of EXCiPACT in ensuring its independence and its independence from undue influence. So we only have as members of a not-for-profit organisation other associations, and they include the Federation of European Chemical Distributors, EXCiPACT in Americas, EXCiPACT China, and of course EXCiPACT Europe, and the UK's Pharmaceutical Group. And we're joined now in our membership by the Chinese Association SPPEA, who are based in Yangzhou. So it's great to have them participating in EXCiPACT and bringing their depth of knowledge to developing great standards for excipients. If you remember, the original standards were first published in 2012, and we focused on good manufacturing processes, the synthesis, purification of excipients, because this dictates mostly the purity and ensures the maximum patient safety from implementing good practices in the manufacture of those substances. And of course, that was complemented by good distribution practices, and kind of distribution there meant in the pharmaceutical world meant holding excipients, repacking, relabeling, redistributing. So distribution with a small d, as in terms of logistics, but also a capital D in terms of those kind of activities which do occur in the pharmaceutical industry. And to complement that, of course, we've now introduced good warehousing practices. So the difference between GWP and GDP is quite important there. Let's have a look at the supply chain, and look, I've got some pictures here to show you because I like to work in pictures. You know, you might think that the excipient manufacturers manufacture excipients, and that supplies the excipient to its pharmaceutical manufacturer, perhaps directly to its customer, and it might be transported directly between those two parties. And that's a very simple view of a supply chain, probably only realistic nationally. There's a direct delivery, perhaps a single vehicle or mode of transport, and likely these days only to be if the two parties are in close proximity and in the same economic zone. So it will get much more complicated than this, as we'll see, but this is the simplest scenario for supply of excipients from an excipient manufacturer to the pharmaceutical manufacturer. And for this, then the totality of EXCiPACT GMP would cover all those aspects. It would indeed cover the transportation, where the excipient manufacturer is responsible for the selection and choice of the haulage company in this particular example. Obviously, if the pharmaceutical manufacturer is contracting with the haulage company, then they send their truck to the excipient manufacturer, then the scope of EXCiPACT GMP won't cover the transportation. But GMP is more than enough for this scenario, and you don't need anything else. That's quite adequate, and the certification scope would cover that completely. However, as we know, there can be distributors in pharmaceutical sense involved in the supply chain. So perhaps the excipient manufacturer makes large quantities of the excipient and then supplies that to a third party who repack and relabel possibly the material. So here we have in the middle of this chain a direct delivery between the excipient manufacturer and a distributor who is then performing repacking, and they then provide material to the pharmaceutical manufacturers through various modes of transport, be it maybe a ship if it's international, or a truck or a lorry if it's a national delivery or a continental delivery. So the manufacturer can provide excipients to the distributor. GMP for EXCiPACT GMP would cover that activity in the same way it covered the activity of the pharmaceutical manufacturer in the first scenario. But now the excipient distributor needs to do EXCiPACT GDP for the repacking operations. And that's the original intent of those two parts of EXCiPACT. The two standards were built for those two particular operations of manufacture and in repacking, relabeling as the classic distributor. And that's a fairly standard process, and that should be quite common throughout the industry. So the two standards have worked very well in the past 9 years that we've had EXCiPACT certification in place. But we wanted to think about securing the supply chain a bit more, because those blue arrows are not quite that simple. There's not quite one truck or one ship. So let's have a look at what's involved in the rest of the supply chain. And if we look at the first scenario of the direct shipment, perhaps from the excipient manufacturer to the pharmaceutical manufacturer, what may be happening is that there's an intermediate warehouse. Literally, it takes the excipients in their original packs, it stores them, maybe consolidates the load with other materials, other excipients, puts them into a container that goes off on a ship to another port and to another country even. It goes into another warehouse where the contents are taken out of the container, then it goes on the truck and it goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturer. Now, for those of us in international supply chains, this is very common. This is the normal mode of transportation. It could be a lorry, it could be a ship, it could be an aeroplane. The mode really doesn't matter. Might even be a train. I hadn't thought of that one. Maybe I need a new icon. But it could be any mode of transport between all of the manufacturer and the user. How do we accommodate GXP into a warehouse? What is it that they should be doing? And feedback from industry and that we've been getting over the years has indicated that good distribution practices was too big in scope, because it covered that repacking, relabeling. The industry mentioned that they wanted something focused just for warehousing, taking it in exactly as it came from the excipient manufacturer, sending it back out exactly as it was. And that's kind of a much reduced version of GDP. And we've called that good warehousing practices, a little unimaginatively, really. What else could we call it? It's about warehousing and stock holding of excipients and good practices there. So in this, the excipient manufacturer can provide the excipients to the logistics company. They can then hold that. They may consolidate the loads, as I mentioned, and there can't be any repacking or relabeling. So in this sense, the identity of the excipient is preserved. We have very clear line of sight back to the excipient manufacturer. And in this scenario, then we have EXCiPACT GDP applying as it always has to the excipient manufacturer, but the GWP for EXCiPACT, the new standard, then would apply to the warehouses. And of course, the supply chain isn't that simple either. It can involve all of these three actors together at various times. And here's an example of how the flow of excipients from a manufacturer all the way to the pharmaceutical drug product maker could be occurring. And there could indeed even be distribution, repacking and relabeling involved in that. Perhaps, you know, the pharmaceutical manufacturer has a special use for the excipient. They want smaller quantities rather than the large quantities which can come direct from the excipient manufacturer. And all of those different actors and different logistics companies can have a role to play. And what we wanted to do with EXCiPACT was to make sure that we'd covered all the major stopping bases. So that's the manufacturer, the distributor, as in repacking and relabeling, and the warehouses. So they're all covered now by the EXCiPACT suite of standards, and you can have assurance that the excipient is looked after to the best possible standards in its journey from the manufacturer to the pharmaceutical drug product maker. So the 2021 edition of the standards also includes GWP as an annex. So it's a separate annex. A lot of the text is absolutely identical to GMP and GDP. The basics of GXP, of course, are all the same. You need a quality management system. You need a complaints process. You need a product recall procedure, and so on. All of those things are the same. But some of the aspects related to manufacturing or to repacking and relabeling have been omitted in the good warehousing practice. So it's a very slimmed down section of the absolute basics that you need to be doing to look after the quality of the excipient. And you'll still have to do those risk assessments, which forms the core part of EXCiPACT in terms of what kind of infrastructure controls do I need? Do I really need pest control and things like that? Those questions can be answered by doing the risk assessments in EXCiPACT the same way as they have with GMP and GDP. There have been some adjustments we've had to make in the scheme to allow for GWP audits to occur, and those are some adjustments to the Annex to ISO 17021-1, which is really the certification body quality requirements. So these are the things the certification bodies have to conform to in order to deliver an audit against EXCiPACT GWP. And of course, that links back into auditor competency. The key thing there is that there are small adjustments, but they're quite significant. One of them is the possibility for what in ISO terms is called multi-site audits. Now, for manufacturing and distribution, GMP, GDP, these are not allowed in EXCiPACT. So I might have 3 manufacturing sites, they're all identical, run identical management systems, and what ISO would say is, well, I can sample manufacturing site number 1, and manufacturing site number 2 and number 3 can share the same certificate. And because we've audited 1, it's okay for 2 and 3. And next year we'll go into 2, and then we'll go into 3, and carry on like that. Now, that's called ISO multi-site auditing. As I said, it requires all the sites to have the same system, perhaps to be making the same excipients. EXCiPACT has said no, each site needs to be audited because that's what the pharmaceutical industry would expect. They would expect to go and audit each site. Well, EXCiPACT did a risk assessment on this when it looked at warehousing and said, really? It's a warehouse, it's just a cost storage system, it's very simple, if the material comes in, comes out, you can replicate that all over the world, perhaps within an organization you might have 3, 4 warehouses, perhaps even in the United Kingdom. Could we have one EXCiPACT certificate for all of that? Could we allow multi-site auditing? And if we did, what would the rules be? So we decided that the risks there were relatively low. You would still get a lot of assurance from the fact that it's an EXCiPACT audit, but we could compromise the time investment for the warehouses in order to be sampled. All the same, all the warehouses have to be audited to begin with, and then you can move into the sampling process during the surveillance audits. So we've had to make some changes in ISO 17021 Annex to accommodate that option as well. And this allows the certification bodies to implement and complete audits against the GWP standard. The impact on auditor competency, well, there has been none. Any EXCiPACT auditor who's competent to audit against GMP and GDP can, of course, do GWP. It's slightly smaller, there's slightly fewer requirements, of course. So if I'm capable of auditing to GMP, GDP, I'll be able to do GWP audits. And expectation from EXCiPACT is that a GWP audit will be quite short. Really think that you should be able to do a comprehensive audit on a normal warehouse operation in 1 day. There's going to be exceptions for sure. A longer time may be necessary in something very big, rather more complex. Less time maybe if it's a very simple operation. But 1 day feels about right because the bulk of the time is going to be looking at the management system elements. And if you want a GWP certificate, then that follows the same processes for GMP and GDP. You have to have 9001 in first, and then you can have an EXCiPACT audit alongside that, and there's a 3-year audit cycle. So how does all of that work? To remind you, so EXCiPACT has a legal agreement with selected certification bodies where they've signed up to adopt our rules and follow the certification scheme rules. Then they can then offer their services and audits to excipient suppliers. Now, an excipient supplier in this case, of course, could be a warehouse rather than a manufacturer or a distributor. And the excipient supplier has to find a certification body that they want to work with. They're listed on the EXCiPACT website, and you can then allocate an auditor. So the certification body would say, yep, we can do the audit, and if we have an auditor who's qualified and registered with EXCiPACT, they can conduct the audit with the supplier and examine them and verify that they're compliant with the EXCiPACT GXP. In this case, it would be GWP, of course. And then they then provide a report back to the certification body. Remember, it's not the auditor that decides if you get the certificate or not. They can make the recommendation, but they also have to provide the objective evidence of their audit to the certification board inside the certification body, and it's them that independently decides if certification is valid. They can, if that's the case and everyone's happy, of course, then they can issue the certificate. And of course, the excipient supplier can then make the certificate and the audit report available to their customers, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and use that to demonstrate compliance to these good practices. And that will help the pharmaceutical manufacturer to qualify the excipient supplier. If you remember the ascertaining GMP for good guidelines in the EU and also under PICS, the Pharmaceutical Inspection Club, as I call it, where all the regulatory agencies get together, they've adopted the ascertaining GMP for excipients guidelines en masse. So those set of guidelines say that you have to qualify your supplier, and certification they provide can be used in that process as meeting some of the requirements, particularly if they're operating to the correct GMP. So EXCiPACT oversees this, and we make sure that there's a certificate validation. We have register of the auditors, we register the certification bodies, and you can see all of that information on our website. And of course, there's process oversight of that entire process. And we hope complete transparency of all the people taking part in that process. And of course, if I'm an excipient supplier, then you know, it'd be a very good day if there was no observations from an audit. Indeed, I might be a little bit suspicious the auditor had been too kind, but there's always something to find. There's always some improvements we can make. So there will be a CAPA plan, almost always with an audit, especially over a 3-year cycle. So I can make all of that information available to the pharmaceutical manufacturer, the certificate, the audit report, and the CAPA plan if there is one. And what's good practice for the pharmaceutical manufacturer is to check the authenticity of all of that information. So you can actually go to the certification body and say, is this a genuine audit report? Did you issue it? Has it been altered in any way? So if you have any concerns, then that's an option, and the certification body has to have a process to be able to respond to those questions. And of course, you can go on the EXCiPACT website. You can check that the certifying body itself is listed as one of those organizations which can do EXCiPACT audits. You can check the auditor who's signed off on the audit report is one of the EXCiPACT registered auditors. And of course, you can look at the certificate and details up on the EXCiPACT website too and check everything is correct. And that will be good diligence, good practice to make sure everything is balanced. And if you have that, you have a high degree of confidence that the full EXCiPACT certification scheme has been applied to that set of documents provided by the supplier. How many certificates do we have at the moment? Oh, remiss of me not to know, but it's well over 120, nearly 130 certificates globally. And we cover the majority of those countries in the central swathe of the world map there. And there are lots and lots of certificates, of course, available from many excipient suppliers globally. So we have the ability to audit in those countries, and EXCiPACT is always looking to develop competency and to train auditors in the countries where we're not currently present. And perhaps, you know, one of the plus sides, if there can be any plus sides of this terrible pandemic, is that we've been able to utilize this kind of technology to do remote training for auditors, as well as to facilitate, in some cases, remote audits. These are our current EXCiPACT registered certification bodies. So these are well-known organizations which you have been familiar with, no doubt, on the EXCiPACT website for some time. Some of those are what I would call specialist pharmaceutical auditors, and may have some limited abilities to get around the world in order to do audits. Others, of course, are big international certification bodies providing standard ISO style audits, as well as EXCiPACT, and they have a very large footprint and ability to provide audits globally. So I'm certain wherever you are, you should be able to find an EXCiPACT auditor and an EXCiPACT certification body to perform a GWP audit. What are the core advantages then, in summary, really, about EXCiPACT? Well, really, the whole purpose here is minimizing risk to the patient and to maximize the assurance of excipient quality. And what we've done with the good warehousing practices is to build EXCiPACT again into the supply chain. So we concentrate on the manufacturer, then the distributor, now the warehouses. And that means we can assure the quality of the excipient throughout the supply chain to the pharma manufacturer. For sure, the pharmaceutical manufacturers are beginning to recognize more and more that the supply chain is very important in the risk to excipient quality. And it's not just a simple relationship between the manufacturer and the pharmaceutical company. There are others, actors in between, and many pharmaceutical manufacturers are now starting to ask for questions and details of what happens in between those two geographically separate locations. And in this way, EXCiPACT can help to plug that gap with knowledge, with confidence that there are professional organizations holding on to the excipients whilst it's in their custody, passing it on through the supply chain. That gives greater transparency, greater visibility, and greater assurance that the excipient's being looked after. And of course, the advantage there is that the pharmaceutical manufacturer won't necessarily have to audit all those warehouses, as well as the manufacturer. So it helps reduce the audit burden for everybody, including the warehouses, of course. And it's really very cost-effective solution. This allows the pharmaceutical company to focus its resources on the critical points in that supply chain or on the critical suppliers, and it doesn't have to spread its limited audit capability and audit resources over everyone. This is a very powerful advantage from the EXCiPACT certification scheme. And of course, but being immediately available, then it can speed up both that audit process, remembering always that the audit is part of supplier qualification, so it can help accelerate supplier qualification as well. And as I mentioned, this allows the whole chain to be examined and for the pharmaceutical manufacturer to have assurance about that, and can look at the GMP, the GWP, and the distribution, if that's included, in the supply chain. We know that EXCiPACT at the moment is meeting or surpasses most international regulatory guidelines for excipients in many parts of the world, especially those in the PICS countries, where the basic GMPs and GXPs for excipients are explained. EXCiPACT is certainly there. We have heard it commented that EXCiPACT is a gold standard when it comes to meeting expectations of some regulatory authorities. So that's really good. You can be certain that if you're doing EXCiPACT GXP in your organization, that you'll be meeting the needs of a vast majority of regulatory authorities and therefore meeting the needs of your customers globally. EXCiPACT's independent oversight guarantees transparency and reliability, and that's a key thing here in the supply chain. It can be very cloudy. What is going on between the manufacturer and the pharma company? What's happening in this middle? Well, this GWP, along with the GDP, now opens that up and makes it much more transparent, and that you can have a high degree of assurance about the quality throughout that supply chain. And of course, the process is exactly the same as always been with EXCiPACT. The warehouse now can make available an EXCiPACT certificate, an audit report, and provide all those benefits to the pharmaceutical company as well. This way, we maximize the benefits for all parties concerned, but the most important person to benefit, of course, is the patient and ensuring patient safety. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. Just like to open up to any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian, for this insightful presentation on the new Good Warehousing Practices standards in the EXCiPACT certification. Do not forget to submit your questions in the chat pane, and thanks to the attendees who have already submitted one. We received several questions, and here's the first one, Ian. When will the new standard be available on the website for everybody to download?
Yeah. Well, whilst you're in the webinar, of course, you can get that standard from the handout pane on GoToWebinar today. But it will be available on the website, EXCiPACT website, from tomorrow. We wanted to give you all a heads up and a lead in to be able to get a copy today. Thanks for attending. Your free gift.
And another question is, how much will the certificate fee be for an EXCiPACT GWP certificate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, sorry for not mentioning that one. So there's a standard fee of 5,500 euros for GMP or GDP, and for GWP, the EXCiPACT board decided that it would be less. It would be 2,000 euros for a 3-year audit cycle, mostly because the audit times are much lower, and also we've got to recognize that the economics of being a warehouse in the middle of the supply chain doesn't bring with you the same, shall we say, financial benefits as being the manufacturer. And so prices are very keen in that area. The limited income can come from the distribution activities, and we wanted to pitch the certificate a fee that was realistic for that market. So it's going to be 2,000 euros for every 3 years.
Okay, great. On to the next one. So of course, this standard will replace the standard, the previous standards. And one attendee is asking, for how long can we still perform EXCiPACT audits according to version 2017?
Well, that's a really important question, and thank you. There isn't a change of any substance in the GMP standard itself, and when you do have a copy of this, you can see the changes are highlighted in a nice orange text. Where there have been alterations in the GMP, it's been more a question of making sure GWP can fit into it, or there's been slight clarification. We did spot 1 or 2 errors between GMP not being exactly the same as GDP, so we've corrected those. But to all intents and purposes, the new standard is identical to the 2017 for GDP and GMP. So you can carry on using the 2017 in that sense. But obviously, if you have an audit now from a certification body, they will be using the 2021 edition at the next audit.
Okay, thanks for your reply. On to the next one. How does this new concept of GWP reflect in a quality agreement to be executed between distributor and pharmaceutical manufacturer? Is there a new quality agreement format for distributors?
That's another good question. I think it all depends on the commercial relationship. Let's look at it, say, you know, maybe the excipient manufacturer uses a third-party warehouse to hold their excipients in, for example. Well, there should be some sort of legal contract between the two organizations then, and I would say under that legal contract, you would require that particular warehouse perhaps to adopt the EXCiPACT GWP. If the warehouse is kind of independent of the manufacturer, just happens to be a warehouse that holds excipients perhaps from a number of suppliers, and is holding excipients as part of the supply chain, then it would be independent, and there perhaps wouldn't be a quality agreement with the manufacturer. Equally, then there might be, you know, far enough away from the pharmaceutical company not to require a quality agreement in that dimension either. But I think if it's close to the pharmaceutical manufacturer or the excipient manufacturer, then maybe a quality agreement's a good idea. And EXCiPACT has a number of templates which are suitable for GMP and GDP. I would always recommend using the EXCiPACT quality agreement templates. They're very, very suitable for excipients, very widely accepted as well. And you could certainly use the GDP one with some adjustments, of course, to exempt repacking and relabeling from the scope of the agreement. That would be a great start if you need a quality agreement with the warehouse.
Okay, thank you, Ian. If a third-party site is used for storage and shipping location, will the warehouse need to meet the GDP and GWP too?
It only needs to meet GDP if it's going to repack. Okay, so if it's going to take a large bulk container and or change the packaging in any way. So the thought process there is that involves a risk to the excipient because you have to open it with the packaging. Now, if it's not doing that, then it doesn't have to have GDP. GWP will be enough. There is some maybe a grey zone in labelling. Let's look at practicalities of labelling. By relabeling, we mean changing the identity of the excipient in some way, or not being transparent about the original manufacturer. So the relabeling would mean some sort of identity change for the excipient. In some cases, particularly in international shipping, the excipient could come into a warehouse and then it has to have an additional label for health and safety for product stewardship reasons added to comply with local regulations, particularly if the excipient is classified as hazardous in any way. For example, the simplest could be, it comes from the United Kingdom and nothing to do with Brexit, but it goes into Belgium and we need to put a label on in French because English is not the national language, the legal language, so we might need to add a label in French. In that situation, an additional label to comply with that legislation may have to be added by the warehouse. That's a common duty, but it's not relabeling because the original identity of the excipient is always retained. So we're not trying to hide that in any way. It's an additional label. So that would still be GWP. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I hope so. What is the expected audit duration for GWP? And will ISO 9001 be a prerequisite for GWP?
Yes, I'll answer those the other way around. The way EXCiPACT always works is it assumes that a basic quality management system is already certified to ISO 9001, and that's in place, and that's the basics. So that means you do your internal audits, you have your document control, your management review, and so on all the basics. And then EXCiPACT sits on top of that with additional requirements that are required for the good manufacturing, good distribution, and then good warehousing practices that are needed to assure excipient quality. As I mentioned, we would expect in the vast majority of cases, the audit duration would be 1 day, and that EXCiPACT would only take that 1 day. Now, that could be, and we've still to complete pilots on this, 1 day for ISO 9001 plus GWP and EXCiPACT. Okay, it might be 1 day for the two altogether, because quite often people pick the same certification body for EXCiPACT as they do with the ISO 9001, because there's such a big overlap in some of their aspects. But we're anticipating it will be not more than 1 day.
Okay. A further question is on risk assessment. You mentioned risk assessment as a tool to define the extent of what to do to address requirement. Does it mean, an attendee is asking, does it mean that we need to refer to ICHQ 9?
ICHQ 9 contains a list of risk assessment tools that could be useful in the pharmaceutical industry for sure. And of course, when it was published now, over a decade ago, the whole concept of using a risk assessment to help answer the question, what should I do, was new. in the industry, because with all the GMPs before that had been written in a prescriptive manner, you shall do this, which is really easy to implement. But of course, the problems start to arise is when trying to decide if the rule is appropriate to your context. So the classic I always say is, my excipient manufacturing plant is outside for health and safety reasons. We can't put it indoors. There's a big chemical plant and columns and goodness knows what. It's all outside and a piece of steelwork. Yeah, but we still have a pest control program because the GMP says you have to have pest control. But we all know the pest control is totally ineffective outside because it can't constrain insects and birds, for example. Now, what risk assessment allowed you to do is to look at the context of your operation and say, what is it I need to do to protect the quality of the excipient? And to start from there, and then to pull the rules in when you need to. So, right, I'm indoors, the excipient's open, I'm in a clean room, I need a pest control system around that, as an example. Maybe not in the room, but maybe outside the room, in order to protect the excipient. And that's where the control is necessary. And that's one of the buzzwords in the guidance. It says, where appropriate, or as necessary, and words like that appear in the GMP guidance. But what they're really meaning is, where the context means you've got to protect the product, then do this. And that's all EXCiPACT risk assessments are asking you to do. One of the best techniques to use for EXCiPACT risk assessments is a HACCP style of a narrative hazard and identification. You look at probability of the event, the likelihood of then that occurring, and its consequences, come up with a score. And you can include detectability as well if you want to get what's called an RPN number, and then you can set some lines about, if it's above this number, we have to take action to get it down, and if it's below this number, it's okay with what we're doing. That's a really great way of doing an EXCiPACT risk assessment. Because although there are numbers involved, it's really qualitative. And if you go to something much more formal, like an FMEA, for example, then you need hard data on the failure rates. So you have to actually know what the probability is for that failure mode. And I think most excipient manufacturers probably don't have that kind of data at that level. So yeah, do a risk assessment, even in GWP. What's the context of your warehouse? What is it you need to control? What infrastructure needs do you have? Good input would be, does the excipient manufacturer recommend storing it at precise temperatures or in a temperature range? If they do, then you need to control the warehouse to those conditions. If the excipient manufacturer doesn't say anything about those conditions, then you're safe to assume that a standard warehouse, secure from the weather, without any heating or humidity, would be okay.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for your detailed replies so far. We have time for a couple of questions, and the first one is, if the excipient manufacturer has several certifications, including ISO 9001 and ISO 22000, does this have an impact on the EXCiPACT standard?
Well, certainly if you have something like ISO 22000 for in the food industry, you've probably done all the risk assessments that EXCiPACT requires, by and large. And I would definitely seek to repurpose those for EXCiPACT purposes. There's a slightly different focus, of course, between food and the pharmaceutical excipients. So generally, the food GMPs is focusing on microbiology, the wholesomeness of food. It's designed, of course, to be ingested. Entirely close overlap with oral products and destined for oral applications. But the key thing is to look at more than just microbiological contaminations. Look at all sources of contamination. Cross-contamination, particularly important in an excipient manufacturing establishment, and other sources of contamination that you may get from equipment, facilities, and so forth. So it's a great tool. HACCP, as I said, is a great tool for doing EXCiPACT risk assessment. You have to open up the scope to more than just the food critical parts.
Great. And for a company with manufacturing plants with GDP certification in place in Europe and warehouse in other regions such as Latin America or North America, would the GWP multi-site audit approach be valid?
That's certainly something you need to discuss with the certification body, but I might imagine that in multiple countries, you might be challenged to prove that your quality management system in those locations is the same. And the whole premise of a multi-site audit is that the quality management system is the same. You know, a warehouse is kind of a warehouse, is kind of a warehouse. And do you have the same quality management system? Do you have the same corporate cultural values? That could be quite a challenge to demonstrate across different countries. But it's possible, and if the certification body was satisfied, then multi-site auditing may be possible. But don't forget, we'd have to audit every single warehouse once to begin with.
Yeah. Does GWP certification allow food ingredients and pharma ingredients storage at the same warehouse?
Food and pharma at the same warehouse. Great question. Great question. I don't think we said otherwise. I think what you need to do as part of your infrastructure risk assessment is to say this is what we want to do. What is it about the food ingredients that could cause contamination risks or harm in some way to the excipients? And of course, your food GMP will demand you do exactly the same the other way around. Well, how do I make sure this food has not got this nasty contamination from this horrible, hideous excipient? Both parties will have the same question, and you'll need to address that. Now, if they're in original packaging, you know, and secure and sealed, then personally, I would think that there's no real problem there. National legislation may prohibit it, for sure. I know of some countries, even in Europe, where, you know, food must not be transported, for example, with chemicals under any circumstances. And in many cases, excipients are considered by some authorities to be chemicals. So that's prohibited legally. But if it's possible to put those in proximity, then you can do so. But your risk assessment needs to be holistic and cover all aspects. And you need to check, of course, with the legislation. It could happen.
Okay, one last question before our time for today's webinar is nearly over, but one last question, which is, if a warehouse is only responsible for storage of pharmaceutical excipients, no repackaging and relabeling occurs in that facility, but only receipt, storage, and dispatch takes place, does this facility need to take GDP or GWP EXCiPACT certificates?
No, that's the perfect facility for GWP.
Okay.
Absolutely perfect description of DWP. There's no repacking, there's no relabeling, it just brings it in, it's exactly as it, and send it out exactly the same. That's GWP.
Okay, perfect, Ian. Thank you very much for your replies. And again, thank you very much for your insight this afternoon. And of course, thanks to all the attendees who joined us this afternoon. We're wrapping up this very interesting and insightful webinar. One last thing before we close the broadcast. At the end of the broadcast, a feedback survey will pop up on your screens. We do really appreciate if you can take a few seconds to complete that, as it does help us to improve these events and webinars. Yeah. And don't forget to visit our website for the latest news and to keep updated of future events. Yeah. On behalf of EXCiPACT, we wish you a nice rest of the day, and we say to you bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you so much, Stefan.
Thank you.
Great job.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, then.